Hello, ladies and gents. It is Wednesday, the 22nd of December. We're on the module DD103, Investigating the Social World 2, edited by Deborah H. Drake, Andy Morris, Alan Shipman, and Katie Wheeler. Page 24, Introducing Common Resources and Rights. For overview of chapters 2 to 5. Chapter 1 has covered three main areas. 1. Conventional understandings of the natural and the social, which view these are separate and bounded categories, and ways in which this distinction can be useful in examining the relationship between human populations and common resources. 2. The issue of population growth and its relationship to arguments about common resource management. 3. The historical origins of ideas about rights associated with 18th century revolution in France and America, and how thoughts about the relationship between rights, responsibility and ownership have developed within contemporary international debates. This introductory chapter has raised some of the challenges and tensions that categorise debates and common resources, responsibilities of their management, the right to their use, and how the idea of their ownership may be negotiated and contested. The chapters ahead will explore these issues in more detail, and in doing so will draw on a range of environmental, political and economic ideas. In chapter 2, Joe Smith considers the evolution of our understanding and valuing of environmental concerns during the latter part of the 20th century and beyond. He charts the historical development of global environmental imagination and the way of growing public consciousness of threats to common resources affects demands for environmental rights. He also considers the politics of managing environmental change. In chapter 3, Dan Conway and Eddie Wasnage consider the ways that international politics boundaries have created patterns of cooperation and conflict in seeking to manage the and protection rights of access to common resources such as water. In chapter 4, Alan Shipman examines the economic argument that private ownership of the common resources might lead to their being managed more effectively and sustainably, but that this poses challenges to the long-held idea that the common resources are a public right. In chapter 5, Shonil Bhagwat, Nicoletta Jones and Giles Mahan explore the contested land rights of indigenous peoples in the face of commercial exploitation of resources in India, as an example of how property rights and human rights are drawn into debate about common resources. Property rights and human rights are drawn into debate about common resources. In the introduction, the natural and social environmental continually interact. People and their societies are shaped by the landscape's climate conditions and natural resources around them, and these in turn are reshaped by human activity. As discussed in chapter 1, this chapter continues the theme and shows how environmental issues have developed over time. It examines how the environmental movement developed and how later scientific research emerged that prompted a more global imagination about these crises. It explores big questions such as what motivates environmental concern? What are the issues that environmentalists care about or that environmental organisations campaign on? At what scale of issue do they typically work? The chapter includes discussion of conflicting rights and the relationships between human and non-human world in the present day and in the future. This chapter will explore the deep historical and cultural roots of contemporary environmentalists, the influence of the new research in shaping the global environmental imagination over the last few decades, the distinctions between environmentalism as a social movement and the broader policy and political response to the global environmental change research. The value of concepts to social scientists includes the concept of independence in relation to environmental change. Section 1, Environmentalism, a new way of looking at the world. Presents a short history of ideas about the Western world's changing relationship with its environment from the 17th century onwards. Section 2, the emergence of the global environmental imagination, explores the role of research and policy as understanding the significance of environmental problems. Section 3, living in an independent world, new ethics, new politics, explores the concept of independence. Environmentalism, a new way of looking at the world. Environmental issues, environmentalism, and the environment are all terms that are widely used. Activity 1 asks you to pause to think about a bit harder about what these words mean. Take a few minutes to note down some environmental issues that particularly concern you. Think about what the scale they relate to you. In other words, as they're more local, regional, national, or global concerns. Or is this the wrong way of thinking about them? You may want to look back at some of the materials that engage with ideas about the scale in Block 2. In the discussion, everyone will have a unique perspective on these issues. Here is one response given to this question. When I'm walking to the allotment, I might be annoyed by the fumes from a line of cars at the junction, or enchanted by a rare sighting of a kingfisher along the brook. Both of these are very local environmental concerns. They leave me wanting to see less dependence on cars and cities, but also glad at least some wild places have been protected from development, even in cities. But when I watch or read the news, I'm reminded about global environmental issues, particularly climate change and losses of biodiversity. Environmental groups campaign on a wide range of issues on scales ranging from very local to global. They have campaigned to protect specific habitats, such as particular wetlands or forests, and particular species, such as orangutans, whales, or endangered birds. An international body might campaign to protect the Amazon, while a local wildlife group might try to preserve a meadow or wood from development. Such as campaigns have existed for decades in some cases. This page 35, go on page 36 now. For more than a century, in more recent years, environment groups have worked on broader issues, including climate change and resource depletion. These are global concerns and their implications stretch into the future as well as across the planet. 1.1 Environmentalism and Industrialization. Ideas about the environment. Environmental hazard go back further than contemporary concerns about hazardous waste or climate change. Environmental historians who have studied the late Middle Ages point to measure, introduce to manage air quality to London or the water quality of the Thames, for example. By the mid to late 17th century, the writer John Evelyn was drawing attention to the air pollution in London in his book on the city's chronic air problems, published in 1651. Figure 2.1, and the hazard of deforestation in His Majesty's dominions. Ilian's book, Sylvia, or a discourse of forest trees, and the propagation of timber in His Majesty's dominions, published in 1662. Was a response to fears among naval leaders that deforestation threatened their access to timber for ships and hence the nation's security. Evelyn's writings show that population and resource depletion were raised as issues several centuries ago. However, it was the explosive growth of cities, consumption of resources, and large-scale movements of people and goods associated with the Industrial Revolution from the late 18th century onwards that gave impetus to new ways of thinking about humanity's relationship with its environment. The effects of all these changes could be seen, smelt and heard Industrialization was dirty and noisy and dramatically transformed landscape. The Roman movement in the arts and literature can be understood as a direct reaction to these changes. For romantic poets such as Coleridge and Wordsworth, nature was a resource of beauty, spiritual renewal, and fulfillment. It held the potential to transform human experience. Page 37. The inconvenience of the AER and the smoke of London dissipated together with the remedies humbly proposed by FEEFQ. To his sacred majesty and to the Parliament now assembled, these same influence generated new ideas in politics, most certainly William Morris, 1834 to 1896. Distinct brand of socialism, Morris is the best known today as a designer, whose work expresses belief that the pleasure that resides in art is identical with that which dwells in nature. Quoted in Smith 206 p6. Um, Page 6. He was developing these ideas in the context of his workshop, London, the world's first large scale city, which is described as a sordid and loathsome place. Morris felt that the poison of riches was leaching beauty out of the land and warned that green and beautiful places are still left in the countryside of England, but the hand of decay is on them. Henderson, 1978. Page 38. Politics and environment. Initially, Morris supported the work of what today called conservation bodies, such as the Commons Preservation Society, which was created to preserve beautiful open spaces for everyone's enjoyment. It is interesting to note that this society, as their as with other early conservation, heritage, and environmental protection organisations, drew on a combination of legal and publicity tools to try to advance its cause. Modern environmentalists use much the same mix. This was shown in 2014 in the UK when the government sought to introduce legislation allowing the selling of national owned forests. Campaigners employed both lawyers and media specialists, as well as public relation techniques to maximise impact. They were successful in halting the proposed legislation. However, William Morris' contemporary Robert Somerville noted that the Commons Preservation Society's scattered efforts resulting in occasional and hurried glimpse of strange beauty were woefully inadequate. Somerville, 1877, page 22 to 3. One of Morris's responses was that all art should be based in nature. He also argued that the future of art would have to rest with the working class. These two sides together explain intense commitment to handcrafted objects. Morris gave the impulses behind the Romantic movement a political edge by proposing that the working class could only be the future guardians of art if the conditions and purpose of labour were transformed. Page 39. In his book, The New Times Nowhere, Morris offers a vision of a utopian society of contented craft workers who have been set free from industrial capitalism and its oppressive social structures and money. The book combines ethics, aesthetics, ideas about nature and socialism, and a catalogue of evils of capitalism. By contrast with workers under capitalism, Morris' central character, Old Hammond, is free, happy, and energetic. Morris is uncompromising. Apart from the desire to produce beautiful things, the leading passion of my life have been and his hatred of modern civilization. Think of it. Was it all to end a counting house on top of a cinder heap with a Whig committee dealing out campaign to the rich and margarine to the poor in such convenient proportions as would make all men contented together, though the pleasure of the eyes was gone from the world? A key element of Morris' thinking that is prominent in environmentalism today is the way he considered future generations and felt that their interests should be represented in the present. One example of this is thinking is offered in a speech he made arguing for the preservation of old buildings, in which he suggested that we are only the trustees for those who come after us. Less radical contemporaries of Morris pursued more practical steps to protect places and species from the consequences of economic development. In the UK, the National Trust and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds were set up. The purchase of land offered these bodies a direct means of protecting nature and heritage sites. In the US and Syria Club, a conservation organisation was founded and campaigns were initiated to create protected areas all over the developed world. These goals were pursued by gathering influential support, including the newly wealthy and who had been benefited greatly from precisely the economic development that was putting so much pressure on nature. The outcomes varied widely. In the United States, the national parks are publicly owned and tightly protected areas. In the UK, the same term, national parks, describes more loosely regulated areas containing much private property, but the restrictions on how it can be used. Your earlier study of the Cargonaus National Park, Book 1, Chapter 4, highlighted the ways in which these protected areas in the UK can serve as places of residence, work and leisure simultaneously. 1.2 Conflicts between conservation and access resource use. The historian Mark Spence argues that national parks serve as micro microcosm for the history of conflict and misunderstanding that has long characterized unequal relations between the United States and the native peoples. In 1999, the early North American conservationists were particularly concerned to protect what they understood as pristine empty wilderness. The first national park first national park in the United States, Yellowstone, came about in 1872. This saw it designed as public land. However, that was only possible by ignoring the long history of the land by Native Americans. These people, who had often been driven off land, such as the Yellowstone, did not think of them as wild at all, but as landscapes they had managed to provide food and other resources. However, it is important to note that the relationship between land, law, and people is dynamic. The meaning that the public parks of North America hold for people and the use they might be put to were not set in stone. In late 19th century, debates continue today about the unjust nature of the designation of these parks when they were created. Native Americans, who also use the term First Nations to describe themselves, particularly in the context of campaigning and negotiations about treaties, have used their leading role in these debates to gain increased influence over the use of some of those protected areas. Since the late 20th century, the First Nation peoples and their representatives have won more influence over a number of key issues. This has resulted in access to sacred sites, renewal of relationships to ancestral homelands, and revitalization of substance-based knowledge and practices, not to mention the historical significance of reclaiming stolen lands, as well as contesting the use of sovereignty arrangements of national parks. First Nations have often been very active in challenging. Page 42. Destructive land uses outside parks and in establishing their own parks. In 1984, the New First Nations people mounted a huge protest on the steps of the British Columbia legislature, calling for the preservation of the Mears Island from logging. Figure 2.1. The First Nations won the British Columbia Supreme Court case that ordered that the island should not be logged. Mears was made a tribal park by its owners, the Traokiart, the Osart First Nations. A member of the First Nation has set up the tribal park, made a sign that stands at the entrance. He said at its unveiling, "This is a sign that people's going to be affecting people for a long time, helping people understand that their Tia Kuat are here, helping people that don't want to respect our homelands and our waters, helping people that know this belongs to people that are handing it over to the grandchildren." Campaigns such as show that the way people think about the non-human natural environment is often shaped by and shapes the way they think about their identity, history, sovereignty, rights, and the future of their communities. However, the extraction of natural resources from the First Nation lands can also generate debate and conflict within these communities, given the opportunities for revenue and jobs they represent. Carroll argues that substantial issues remain to be solved about the nature of the past enclosure of spaces to create public parks. The cases explored by Carroll raise interesting and important questions about who the public is that is served by the parks, who is sovereign within them, in other words, who has control and ultimate authority over the land, and how very long-term environmental interests are best served. In this article about the relationship between indigenous peoples in North America, the US and Canadian governments, and the way land is organised and used. Carroll points to the potential that tribal parks such as the one created on Mears Island might hold for positive compromises, he finds it. In the hands of indigenous communities, land trust and cultural conservation easements have provided practical ways to reassert rights to traditional territories and in the process create meaningful and productive relationships with non-indigenous landowners and conservation organisations. US Conservationism. A leading American conservationist, Ralph Waldo Emerson, had travelled in Europe and met the Romantic poets. His 1836 book on nature argued that the unity of nature, science and spirituality is summarised a philosophy of religion that even turned transcendentalism, wherein nature offered proof of the presence of the divine in all things. A follower of Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, sought to live out of these ideas and simplify by living of nature for 2 years in the woods. Shows a replica on the site of the hut he lived in during the period. The resulting account of his time living next to Walden Pond in Maine opens us. When I wrote the following pages, I lived alone, in the woods, a mile from the neighbour, in a house which I had built myself, and earned my living by the labour of my own hands only. Thoreau's concerns are very selective, remembered today. He promoted civil disobedience and critic industrialised labour. To his extent, he shared much in common with Morris. However, this championing of individualism, self-sufficiency and hard work, alongside his conviction in the spiritual benefits of preserving natural wilderness, have been better remembered in the US context and speak to a distinctly US ideology. The spiritual strands of his thinking fed into the movement of national parks, which their proponents saw now just as good as in themselves, but as vital to the public health of urban populations. During the 1930s and 1940s, Ansel Adams, one of the most popular photographers in the 20th century, gave visual expression to the idea that the United States' apparent wilderness offered a resource of awe and wonder. Adams' photos have shaped the way many US citizens think about and have represented ideas of US wilderness. Ever since, however, the creation of heavily protected parks was aimed at more than preserving something then from the past. Many in the national parks movement were concerned to offer the current and future inhabitants of the country's fast-growing cities access to clean, fresh, inspiring outdoor spaces. Figure 2.7 offers just one of many thousand examples by images by amateur photographers that pay direct homage to Adams and hint at the value the parks hold for contemporary, most urban US citizens a century after they were created. Page 45, Chapter 1, Environmentalisms, a new way of looking at the world. US conservationists and the artists and writers who formed and promoted their ideas, such as Thoreau and Adams, did much to influence the thinking of environmentalism around the world. Indeed, it is much easier to trace their influence than the socialism of Morris. With his concerns for the everyday experiences of the urban working class, Adams' images of the pristine nature of the Thoreau's writings from his solitary cabin confirm the 20th century environmental movement was as much about protecting the environment from people as it was protecting it for people. The environmentalism viewed cities and everyday human life not as part of the environment, but as an ever-present threat to a fragile nature. As in Evelyn's time, increasing numbers of people gathered in the city of settlements, creating pollution and resource pressures that threaten the environment. Yet 20th century environmental groups tended to view cities and society as a source of threats to a separate nature rather than as themselves the subject analysts on campaigning. Are the individuals that have shaped environmentalism more concerned with the past, present, or future? You might want to refer to some of the people's referenced in section 1, such as Morris, Thoreau, and Adams. In this discussion, this is a difficult question to answer, even if you have a great deal more information to hand than present in this chapter. It is possible to say that Morris drew heavily on the idealized notion of past to a picture of the utopian future in his tale News from Nowhere. Thoreau is drawing on nations of an idyllic past when he seeks to simplify his life and rely on his own wits when living for 2 years at the Walden Pond, although he clearly wants to influence ideas about how society should live in future. Adams' photographs can suggest that his ideas about national parks are simply about conserving them in a particular pristine state. In fact, the US national parks movement was also influenced by a desire to give the populations of the United States fast-growing cities access to clean air in the wilderness. In the summary, this short history of ideas about the Western world's relationship with its environment has shown that concerns about environmental degradation stretch back of the 17th century. Concerns increased with industrialization, expanding urbanization in 19th and 20th centuries. The sections introduce ideas about conflicts over land uses and emergence of new forms of legal protection of the natural world, including the creation of national parks. Page 47, Emergence of a Global Environmental Imagination. Through the course of the 20th century, the global north saw fast-paced economic development in step with the great advances in technology and science, and steady increase in both human numbers and in rates of consumption, above all in cities and towns. These changes meant that the new forms of environmental pollution were being generated, but also the science researchers were capable of better understanding the issue at stake. Both the experience of environmental and social costs associated with the environment degradation and the newly emerging environmental sciences. It contributed to new ways of thinking about environmental change and humanity role in it. 2.1. The widening resonance of local incidents. 20th century economic development brought security and leisure to many more people, but the pollution it brought. It was also started to take some of the fun out of life. Evidence of pollution took several forms. Some could only be traced in the wake of a careful research. However, city dwellers did not need scientists to tell them where they were under threat. They could taste it in the air. Particularly weather conditions would leave them choked in by air pollution. The combination of the use of solid fuel, especially coal, in homes and electricity generation, together with the rapid growth in road transport, created smogs, a term to describe a combination of smoke and fog. Dense smog were experienced in all large cities and had been notorious since the late 19th century, 1952. The combination of weather conditions and increased use of coal led to what had long been nicknamed P. super fogs. There was a sharp increase in death rates at public health research directly associated with air pollution. It was not possible for public health researchers to establish precisely the number of deaths above the normal rate, and many of those who died were already suffering from respiratory problems. But the spike in numbers dying was very clear once all available data had been gathered. This marked increase in death rates, supported by clear evidence of cause and effect, combined the media pressure and widespread direct experience of smogs, drove the government to legislate for measures that would improve air quality. Activity 3, figure 2.8, 2.9 and 2.10 offer three different kinds of evidence about the London smogs 1952, a photo, a newspaper article and a graph. How do each tell the story significant event and what ways do they differ? The photograph of a football goalkeeper appearing at the smog instantly tells a story about the direct physical experience of the smogs. Also, a human interest, the glory's central character engaged in particular very experienced kind of storyline, rooted in comparison with past experiences and other factual evidence gathered by the reporter. The headline, however, has been carefully composed to attract attention in a paper full of stories. The graph that plots death rates against the levels of smoke in the air through the relevant period in December 1952 offers an even more analytical form of evidence. Rooted in careful research, such as graph can lend impact to newspaper story, but are also influential in convincing politicians, policymakers, and medical professionals of the need to act. Worse than 1862. The cholera deaths after fog. The rise in deaths in the week after London's Great Fog early in December was greater than the worst week in the cholera epidemic 1866. This is disclosed in a report of the Health Committee of London Community Council, which will be considered by the Council on Tuesday. The committee reports that the figures reported to Council Observation Station and the Council Hall smoke or the sulphur pollution of the atmosphere of 7.8 at the highest which can be traced in records, which is due back to 1932. That's just a newspaper article on page 49. I think I'm going to do one more page. I've got a bit of a headache today. Don't actually know why. Nearly up. Mind you, I ain't got many pages to go to. Oh, never mind. I'm going to do this one page and that'll do it. A very similar kind of risk of human health created by modern life was much more difficult to identify. In 1956, a Japanese fishing port of Minamata gave its name to neurological disease that eventually killed at least 300 people in two regions of the country. Researchers identified an industrial process that had resulted in leaking of mercury compounds into the bay was responsible for here. The mercury was made into human diets by travelling along the food chain in the community, whereas fish and seafood formed the very important parts of diet and local economy. The toxic metal had gradually built up in the bodies of shellfish and fish that were consumed by humans. It took nearly 2 decades to win any compensation for the victims. Minamata was a company town, whereas Chiso Corporation had huge economic and political influence. The Chiso Corporation exposed campaigns for compensation, with events centering on the uncertainties about the cause of effect. However, it was proven through a careful medical and environmental research the industrial pollution originating in Chiso plants that had resulted in mercury getting into the food chain. An American photographer married to a Japanese woman spent 2 years in 1972 and 1973 in the area cataloguing daily life. He curated moving portraits of the victims. One of the most affecting images was the mother bathing her severely disabled son. The image travelled around the world, both putting pressure on the company and lending further momentum to the environmental movement, such as an image gave a human face to this environmental problem. In 1973, a lawsuit was won on behalf of the victim. With this divisive verdict, the defendant's factory was a leading chemical plant with the most advanced technology and should have assured the safety of wastewater. The defendant could have prevented the occurrence of Minamata disease, or at least have kept it at a minimum. We cannot find that the defendant took any of the precautionary measures called for in his situation whatsoever. The presumption that the defendant had been negligent from beginning to an end in discharging wastewater from its insectidide plant in amply supported the defendants cannot escape liability for negligence. In the same period, former US government biologist Rachel Carson demonstrated that good research and a populist approach to publicity could progress environmental concerns. She had been gathering evidence that might explain declining bird populations and other changes in nature. She identified the pesticide, the dichloromethane, DDT, it's about a 30-letter word, I can never pronounce that, as a likely culprit. This was difficult news. The chemical had played a central role in humanity's struggle to treat typhus and malaria due to the effectiveness against mosquitoes. Yet Carson persuasively argued that the widespread and indiscriminate use of changing natural systems, evidence alone might not have sufficient. She was engaging writer and phrase maker, and a well-chosen title in a 1962 book. The Silent Spring helped to lodge it in the bestsellers list specifically, and she focused on threat that DDT posed to songbirds, hence the title, and made her clear that it would be victims of the industrial chemical. Carson's also showed how environmental science was tracing the way persistent chemicals travelled. She showed how they were released by the US industry and then made their way into the body tissue of Antarctic penguins, thousands of miles away. Page 52. I'm going to leave it there. I've got a raging headache.